Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your country no longer exists. Not because it was conquered all at once, but because it was destroyed little by little, man by man, field by field, until almost nothing remained. That is exactly what happened to Paraguay between 1864 and 1870, in the most devastating war South America has ever seen. A conflict so brutal that it forever changed the destiny of an entire nation. If you truly want to understand how power, ambition, and the price paid by peoples for the decisions of their leaders work, stay until the end of this video, because what you are about to hear is going to shake you to your core. And before we continue, if you are interested in the history nobody taught you in school, subscribe right now and hit the bell, because every week we bring you exactly that kind of content. To understand why this war broke out, we need to go back to the heart of South America in the mid-19th century. Paraguay was, at that moment, a deeply peculiar country. While the rest of the American continent lived under the shadow of economic liberalism and the direct influence of European capital, Paraguay had taken a completely different path. Since independence in 1811, the country had been governed by a series of authoritarian leaders who bet on isolation as a survival strategy. The first of them, Dr. José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia, known simply as El Supremo, ruled for nearly 3 decades with an iron fist. He banned foreign trade without state supervision, closed the borders to foreigners, seized lands from the church and the wealthy Creoles, and concentrated power in a way that his contemporaries could hardly comprehend. When Francia died in 1840, the country went through a brief period of transition before Carlos Antonio López took control. López was less secretive than his predecessor. He gradually opened the country to the outside world, promoted the construction of the first railroad in South America, brought in European engineers and technicians, and developed a considerable military industry. By the time he died in 1862, Paraguay had a well-trained army, a relatively solid economy, sustained by exports of yerba mate, timber, and tobacco, and an infrastructure that, though modest, was functional. What it did not have was a mature political class capable of handling what was coming next. The son of Carlos Antonio López, Francisco Solano López, assumed power at the age of 36. He was an ambitious, charismatic man, obsessed with the figure of Napoleon Bonaparte, whom he tried to imitate even in his uniform. He had traveled to Europe in the 1850s, had observed the military might of the great powers, and had returned convinced that Paraguay could become the arbiter of the balance of power in the Rio de la Plata. That dream of greatness, mixed with an authoritarian and explosive personality, would be the fuse that lit the powder keg. The regional situation was an explosive cocktail. Brazil was an imperial monarchy governed by Pedro II, a regional power with direct interests in the affairs of Uruguay and the Plata. Argentina, under the government of Bartolomé Mitre, sought to consolidate its regional hegemony after decades of civil wars. Uruguay was a small country divided between 2 factions, the Colorados and the Blancos, and each of the great neighboring powers backed one of the sides. When Brazil militarily intervened in Uruguay in 1864 to support the Colorados, Solano López interpreted it as a direct threat to his own power and to Paraguayan independence. His response was to declare war on the Brazilian Empire. What seemed like a calculated move quickly became a catastrophic mistake. To attack Brazil by land, Paraguay needed to cross Argentine territory, specifically the province of Corrientes. Solano López ordered that invasion without Argentina's permission, which immediately pushed Mitre to join the alliance with Brazil. Uruguay, now governed by the Colorados with Brazilian support, completed the trio. Thus was born the Triple Alliance: Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay against Paraguay, David against 3 Goliaths, but with the difference that this David was a country of barely 500,000 inhabitants, surrounded by powers that together numbered tens of millions. Here I want to ask you to pause and leave me a comment. Do you think Solano López was a hero who defended his people, or a tyrant who led them to the slaughterhouse? Write to me below, because there are 2 completely opposite versions of this man, and I want to know what you think before we finish the video. At the beginning of the war, the Paraguayan army surprised everyone. It was a disciplined force, well armed by regional standards, and deeply motivated by a sense of national pride that Solano López had carefully cultivated over the years. Paraguayan troops invaded the north of Argentina, managed to occupy part of the province of Corrientes, and advanced toward the south of Brazil with an audacity that nobody had anticipated. For a few months, it seemed that Paraguay could actually sustain the war and force a favorable negotiation. But the strategic reality was crushing. Brazil had access to international credit, primarily from British banks in London, which allowed it to finance a prolonged war. Argentina could recruit soldiers across a vast territory. Paraguay, on the other hand, was a small, landlocked country without access to the sea, without external credit, and with a population base that would be exhausted long before that of its enemies. As the war advanced and casualties mounted, Solano Lopez began recruiting teenagers, and then children, to fill the ranks of the army. It is said that in the final stages of the conflict, there were Paraguayan soldiers of 12 or 13 years of age, fighting with improvised lances because there were no longer enough weapons. The Battle of Curupayty in September of 1866 was one of the most impressive moments of Paraguayan resistance. The Allied forces, confident in their numerical superiority and the support of their river fleet, attempted to take a heavily entrenched Paraguayan position on the Paraguay River. The result was a disaster for the alliance. More than 9,000 Allied casualties against only 92 on the Paraguayan side. It was such a crushing victory that it forced the Allies to completely rethink their strategy and delayed their advance by almost a year. But the victory at Curupayty did not change the fundamental equation. Paraguay was still a country without the resources for a long war, and the alliance, despite its losses, could afford to wait. In 1868, the Allied forces finally managed to surround the main Paraguayan defensive line at Humeda, a fortress that had held out for months under nearly medieval conditions. When Humeda fell, Paraguay's fate was sealed. What followed was a pursuit that lasted 2 more years. Solano Lopez refused to surrender, rejected any kind of negotiation, and dragged the remnants of his army, increasingly composed of teenagers and old men, through the jungles and swamps of the country's north. The Paraguayan leader grew paranoid, ordering the execution of hundreds of people accused of treason, among them his own brother and several of his closest collaborators. History records interrogations under torture, mass shootings, and a growing paranoia that consumed the man who had pushed his nation into the abyss. On March 1, 1870, in the ravine of Cerro Cora, Brazilian troops finally caught up with Solano Lopez. According to accounts from survivors, the marshal attempted to escape while wounded, was struck by a lance that pierced his abdomen, and when Brazilian soldiers demanded he surrender, he responded with a phrase that would become legendary: "I die with my homeland." Moments later, he was dead. He was 43 years old. And now comes the part that should impact us the most, the part that textbooks rarely mention with the rawness it deserves. When the war ended, Paraguay had lost between 60 and 70% of its total population. Some historians estimate the figure is even higher. The country that in 1864 had approximately 500,000 people, by 1871 had barely between 150,000 and 200,000. And of that surviving population, the vast majority were women, children, and the elderly. Men of productive age had been decimated. It is estimated that for every adult man who survived, there were between 4 and 10 women. Paraguay was left a country of widows, of orphans, of ruins. The economic consequences were equally devastating. The peace treaties forced Paraguay to cede territories to the north to Brazil and to the south to Argentina, losing access to strategic natural resources it had disputed for decades. The country was forced to take on enormous debts to pay war reparations, debts that would weigh on its economy for generations. The land was auctioned off at rock-bottom prices to Argentine and Brazilian speculators, which destroyed the agrarian structure that the Lopez family had built and turned Paraguay into a country of landless workers. What happened to Paraguay is an essential case study for anyone who wants to understand how wars not only kill people, but destroy the social fabric of an entire nation. A society that loses the majority of its adult men does not only suffer in the moment, it suffers for generations because the chains of transmission of knowledge, of trades, of cultural memory, of institutions are broken. Paraguay took decades to recover a population comparable to that before the war. and some historians argue that the aftermath of the conflict can still be felt today in the way the country relates to its neighbors and in the structural inequalities that marked its development. There is something else that is rarely mentioned when this war is discussed: the role of foreign capital. While Paraguay bled out, British banks were financing the Triple Alliance campaign with millions in loans. This is not a conspiracy theory or a far-fetched claim. It is a documented fact in the financial archives of the era. Brazil and Argentina ended the war indebted to London's banking houses, and Paraguay was left destroyed. The only real winner, the one who collected interest from both sides, was international financial capital, which found in this tragedy an extraordinarily profitable business. That pattern of wars financed by debt that benefit third parties while destroying entire nations did not die in 1870. It continued repeating itself throughout the 20th century and remains absolutely relevant today. If you made it this far, you already know more about the War of the Triple Alliance than 90% of people who have heard of it by name. And that matters to me, because I believe that understanding real history, without filters or simplifications, is what allows us to think more clearly about the present. Before you go, I need to ask you something. Leave me a comment telling me which part of all this struck you the most. Was it the scale of the destruction? The contradictory figure of Solano Lopez? The role of foreign capital? Or something completely different that came to you while you were listening? Your comment not only helps me understand which topics interest you most, but also helps this video reach more people who deserve to know this story. And if you want to keep going down this path, the next video you should watch is about another war that was also never told to you the way it really happened. One that changed the map of South America in ways that are still debated in the chancelleries of the continent. See you there.